Hello and welcome to this quick tip tutorial video. Today I'm going to show you 5 sound design tips for giving your sound a retro edge. I'm using FXpansion Strobe2 and I'll be using sounds from a new Strobe2 expansion pack called Synthetic Resistance, which takes its inspiration from synthesizers from the late 70s and early 80s. If you're a fan of synth music from this era, or you're just looking for a nostalgic feel to give your productions, do check it out. Links will appear on screen now or in the description below. Tip number 1. Use noise as a modulation source. Here's a sound that emulates a Roland SH101 synthesizer. It's quite normal to use noise as a sound source alongside your normal oscillators. You can see here though that I've used noise as a modulation source to modulate other things. In this case, noise is modulating pulse width modulation and the filter cutoff frequency. This is something you could do in the Roland SH101 that this sound was based on, and it gives you some extra grit that you can't get by just adding noise as a sound source. I'm going to mute this mod slot so that the noise is no longer modulating the cutoff or the pulse width modulation, and we'll have another listen. And here it is with the modulation. So you can hear it has the effect of destabilizing the oscillator or the filter. I'm going to show you one more example of this. This is a sound that uses a delay effect, and I've actually used noise to modulate the delay time to give the delay a really sort of retro, noisy feel to it. There it is with. Without, and then with again. Tip number 2, limit your mod sources. A lot of early analog synths, specifically mono synths, didn't have many modulation sources. You might have one envelope or one LFO, so limit yourself to those. Just because you've got more doesn't mean you should use them. So in this patch, I'm using amp envelope in its normal way to control the amplitude of the final sound, but I'm also using it to open up the filter cutoff. Now I could have used this spare modulation envelope here, which isn't used in this patch, but in order to get a more authentic sound, I've stuck to using the one envelope. So now, when I change the amp envelope settings, it's not only changing the volume of the patch through time, it's also opening the filter cutoff. Tip number 3, use random mod sources. You might be able to see up here an M-rand modulation source. You can also see that it's affecting the fine tuning, the square wave amount, the shape of the sub-oscillator, the filter cutoff, and even the panning. So what this modulation source is doing is adding a small amount of randomization to each note. There's a new random value for each parameter for each note. I'm going to play just a bunch of notes in a row, and I'm going to mute the random modulation source, and I'll also mute that noise so that we can actually hear it without any modulation. You should be able to hear it's fairly static on each one. Now I'm going to unmute the random modulation source. And you should be able to hear some slight variation in each note. Now, along with the noise source from tip 1, we get this just gives each note its own peculiarity, so you're not hearing that kind of digital copy every single time. Tip number 4, use mono LFOs. Here's a kind of Roland Juno inspired pad sound. And if I increase the modulation wheel, you'll be able to hear the LFO. Now you wouldn't think there'd be much in it, but actually if I slow this LFO down, you'll see what's going on. And I'll just double click on this scope so that we can see. The LFO is constantly moving, its phase does not reset. In the LFO's options, I've got this mono button enabled, and I've also got the LFO gate set to song. Mono means that there is only one LFO. There is not a separate LFO for each note. This is a polyphonic sound. It can play up to 8 voices, but each of those voices uses the same LFO. And this LFO gate parameter affects how the phase is reset for that LFO. So normally this would be on poly, which means that the phase would reset on every polyphonic note on. But we don't want the phase to be reset at all. I want the LFO to just keep freewheeling. So I'm going to change it to song. And the result is we get that kind of exaggerated tape wow effect. Tip number 5, roll off the top end. So this is a simple sound. So in this sound, I've got a couple of effects that I want to look at. The first is this low pass filter, which is on the entire sound. If I take this off, you'll hear a lot of sort of digital brightness. I'm also going to disable this dirty DAC, which we'll come to in a minute. But if I disable the low pass, you'll hear a much brighter sound. So rolling off the top end really makes a huge difference. Synths that were recorded back in the 70s and 80s were often recorded to tape, often even to cassette, which didn't have great frequency responses. So it's an easy way to get a kind of nostalgic sound. And also it can take out some of the harshness of modern digital synthesizers. The other thing you can do in Strobe 2 is use this dirty DAC effect, which is found in the distortion category. It emulates old digital to analog converters. Now I like to use this before the filter, so actually the filter rolls off some of that aliasing. So here's the sound with the aliasing but no filter. And here's the sound with the filter. So that's my top 5 tips for adding a retro edge to your sound design. Let us know if you've got any tips in the comments, and I'll leave you now with some demos of the synthetic resistance Strobe 2 sound pack.